Games like to copy all the time. As it turns out, games have been copying everything for years. They copy ideas so often that entire genres are built on copying the last big thing that worked. And yet, somehow this isn't illegal. What fascinates me most is Lies of P, a game that copies the exact formula of Dark Souls, then fuses it with the imagery of Pinocchio and somehow gets away with it. Because speaking purely from a legal perspective, this feels wrong. Copying this much shouldn't be legal. So what's actually going on here? How can games copy this blatantly? Why does the law... It's no secret that FromSoft's Dark Souls is one of gaming's greatest series. Due to the popularity of these games, it has spawned many, and I mean many, copies of it. There have been so many copies that people have coined a genre for these games called Souls-like. A few of these Souls-like have provided a decent experience that comes close to the Souls series. Some are just straight up trash, but none of them quite do it like Lies of P. Lies of P plays so true to a Souls game that it can be extremely difficult to distinguish the game as a game not created by FromSoft.
The level design, enemy layouts, and just overall game feel and pace of combat are eerily similar to an actual FromSoft game to a degree that I haven't seen before. It can be a little uncanny.
Uncanny is the perfect way to describe it. The entire feel of the game is like some sort of perfect combination of Dark Souls, Sekiro, and Bloodborne. Lies of P feels uncanny for a reason. It doesn't just play like Dark Souls, it imitates it. And that imitation mirrors the very story it tells. The puppets in Lies of P move like humans, speak like humans, fight like humans, but they aren't quite human. In the same way the game moves like a Souls game, feels like a Souls game, and punishes like a Souls game, but it isn't quite one. That unease the player feels, that sense of familiarity mixed with discomfort, is intentional. The game's cloned mechanics become a metaphor for its world. Lies of P isn't ashamed of being a copy, it leads into it, using imitation as a narrative language, but that is exactly what gives it its identity. I genuinely think Lies of P may be the first Souls-like that improves on the formula set by FromSoft. Lies of P provides better quality of life features compared to Dark Souls, like cutting boss runbacks, implementing a unique weapon modification system, and that weapon sharpening feature. I mean, there are countless features that in my experience makes Lies of P a better game than Dark Souls. Now, before you all go ballistic, I know Dark Souls 1 is one of the greatest games of its time. I don't dispute that, but in this modern era, Lies of P for me tops it. It is evident some sort of split has occurred from Dark Souls 3. FromSoft themselves have gone down this path with Elden Ring that feels like a successor to Dark Souls through its gameplay and imagery, but expands to this open world behemoth that once again innovated the genre beyond its clones. Although it's meant to be the successor, it really isn't. That is why it isn't named Dark Souls 4. It is an intentional separation from the series. On the other path, Lies of P stayed true to that original linear style and quite possibly made a better spiritual successor to Dark Souls than FromSoft themselves. I welcome this copying because it continues innovating on something that is already great, with FromSoft now pushing their focus to a more expansive world. Round 8 may just be the right innovators to push that Dark Souls formula forward in the original style. Yet, the legal logic in me is still telling me that such copying shouldn't be possible, so how are they allowed to just copy this gameplay? Copyright does not protect ideas, rules, systems, or methods of operations. It only protects the expression of those ideas. For games, this means the gameplay mechanics and concepts are considered unprotectable ideas. FromSoft introduced a brilliant formula that legally is just an abstract game concept. Anyone is free to create a new game based on similar principles. The action of using a weapon to attack an enemy with right bumper is not an expression that can be copyrighted. It is just a gameplay mechanic that are fundamental to an action RPG game. As long as they don't copy the actual copyrighted content such as the code, dialogue, art assets, level layouts, or text, the actual Souls-like concept cannot be copyright infringement. With such a lack of protection, it makes you question why the law would take this approach for games. To put simply, without copying, games would get stale fast and be dominated by a few games. Game genres are very broad. Simply allowing the game developer to benefit from a copyright would seriously lock out competition and limit game development. Think of all the genres of games we have: RPGs, horror, racing, and so on. Just because a game fits a category doesn't mean it's original enough to claim that category. In short, no one gets to monopolize a game genre or gameplay mechanic through copyright. Throughout the history of games, there have been a few outliers that take concepts, mechanics, and vision beyond industry standard, innovating to levels never seen before. When Doom released in 1993, it had such an influence on the future of FPS games that practically any new FPS game for that time was considered the Doom clone. The game was that good that every FPS had to copy Doom, creating a genre today called boomer shooter. I mentioned Doom's influence because it really reaffirms two things: that when a game succeeds, it is inevitable that so-called clones will follow. Some will be more discreet about it than others, but it will happen. Why it happens? To pay homage to the original or just an easy money grab? Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Innovation inspires imitation. The second is that copying is the only way to allow for a genre to flourish, because instead of one group or company holding the rights to a certain style of gameplay, all of a sudden an entire industry works together on what is successful to produce quality beyond the genre. It is from this copying that pushed the standards and fundamentals of FPS games beyond what had been seen before, and inspiration can honestly come from anywhere. Ultra Kill is a crazy indie clone of Doom made by one solo developer. The ability to copy the fundamentals of Doom's style allowed for creativity to flourish in other areas not seen from the original creator. What is clear is that copying is a shared language of game design that benefits the industry and players. Players get dozens of brilliant titles that scratch that same itch found in their favourite game, with slight tweaks, amendments and innovations that just about make it different. The lack of copyright on game mechanics reminds us on something we often forget. Beneath it all, stripped to a core, is a genre of game we are playing. Whether that's an RPG, survival, sport, or even a board game, nobody can copyright it, because the idea of a game belongs to humanity as a whole.
That book reminds me, have you ever heard the fairy tale about a mischievous wooden puppet?
So Lies of P doesn't infringe on copyright for gameplay mechanics, but surely they do for its art, image, and storytelling, as these are expressions that can be copyrighted. Personally, walking through Lies of P's Krat has been one of my favourite worlds to explore in any game. From the very beginning, you're dropped into this gothic nightfall of absolute despair, a city frozen in decay, lit by gas lamps and eerie moonlight. Krat feels less like a real place and more like a dream world, or maybe a nightmare. There's something deeply unsettling about it, like a children's story that's gone wrong. The architecture is elegant, almost beautiful, but rotting on every corner. The streets feel staged, theatrical, as if the city itself is pretending to be alive, only interacting with you when you choose to play. And that's where it perfectly captures the eeriness at the heart of Pinocchio. This is a world built on imitation. That uncanny gap between what they look like and what they are is what makes the world so uncomfortable to exist in. As a player, you're constantly aware that something is off. The art and the world building is a huge factor attributed to the success of Lies of P. But it is a world that belongs to Pinocchio, a story copied by Round 8. When Lies of P was first announced, confusion arose over how the developers were able to use such a household name like Pinocchio as their protagonist of their game. They were able to copy the story of Pinocchio because Carlo Collodi, the author of The Adventures of Pinocchio in 1883, died in 1890. Copyright law protects the original creator's work for their entire life plus 70 years after they've died. This inevitably expired in 1960. Once a work's copyright term ends, anyone is free to use the original text, characters, and story elements without permission or payment. The law's aim here is to prevent work from being withheld from humanity as a whole. Once the author of that work has died and their children have also benefited from that work, it's time for it to contribute back to society and to be used whichever way they wish. The developers explicitly chose Pinocchio as their basis because the story lies in the public domain, giving them a ready-made narrative foundation that they could freely build upon. As the director of the game Choi Ji-won noted, working with a tale that has a public domain allowed the team creative latitude to focus on their own interpretation of the story and setting without legal hurdle. Now, a key distinction is that The Lies of P is not copying Disney's other modern rendition. It specifically uses the assets of Pinocchio's novel set out in 1883. The law wants copyrights to end for this very reason, to innovate beyond the original means. Pinocchio has been created and endured by the masses, but in our society, it was innovated into a fantastic artistic game. The team deliberately sought out a famous story they could twist. The built-in familiarity of Pinocchio provided an instant fanbase and recognition factor to help Lies of P stand out in a crowded genre. In copying, it has also brought the story of Pinocchio closer to its real origin. The original Pinocchio story is surprisingly dark in tone, featuring cruelty and moral peril that might shock those only familiar with the Disney film. Therefore, the lack of there being a copyright in place has empowered the developers to amplify those darker elements and invent a new gothic interpretation. Lies of P exemplifies how creators can leverage that heritage to craft something at once nostalgic and yet novel. Lies of P exemplifies why copying in art shouldn't be seen as a negative. Having the well-known game formula in Dark Souls and Pinocchio's framework inspired the team to go wild with their ideas. Because they had a safety net of familiarity, they could innovate in other areas without alienating players. This dynamic shows that standing on the shoulders of giants often allows artists to reach higher than they would have alone. Games copy because they have to. Without copying, genres wouldn't exist, and innovation would suffocate under ownership claims. Lies of P proves that copying isn't theft, but the shared language of mechanics, themes, and ideas. The law allows this because it protects expression, not systems, ensuring that no one can monopolize how games are played. What makes Lies of P special isn't that it copied Dark Souls, but set its own path among the genre of Souls-like. Like Pinocchio itself, the game is a creation born from imitation, striving to become something real. And in doing so, it shows that copying isn't an enemy of creativity, it's the reason games keep moving forward.